discussant is Benjamin Keys from Wharton.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me today. Thanks to the organizers. And I want to commend the organizers as well for putting a paper like this one on the program to get in front of both policymakers and folks from the financial advice industry to think about some of these problems that I think have been laid out as cleanly as I've ever seen them laid out in this paper. I think this is a paper that really takes a clever approach to identification, that brings really unique data to bear, and answers a question that where you'd think the deck would be stacked very much against finding the types of results that they find. So I was really pleased to have the chance to discuss this paper. So we actually have very similar motivation in terms of thinking about this question and why it's important. About half of households, thanks to the work of Anna Maria Lusardi and her co-authors and their surveys, pushing these questions to be more widespread, and so we're getting a better sense of this type of financial hardship. About half of all households say they probably or definitely could not come up with $2,000 in 30 days. And that's a pretty shocking number, especially given how unrepresentative it is of the people in this room, right? So this is something that most of the people in this room would have absolutely no trouble doing in terms of, I don't know, maybe just what's in your wallet right now, but more likely what's coming from your next paycheck, or that's certainly on your credit card in terms of available liquidity. And it's a tough fact to face, but most Americans have very little liquid savings, but at the same time, they face very frequent expense shocks. So a really useful survey from Pew in 2015 found that 60% of households experienced a significant financial shock in the past year, and the median amount of the most expensive shock was $2,000, which is, lines up well with my first statistic. Half of people can't come up with $2,000 very easily, and these are shocks not just medical bills, and we've heard a lot about health expenses, but also things like auto repair, home repair, or income volatility. So shocks to their job in terms of either hours or wages, and there's been a lot of well-documented research that's shown that income volatility has risen sharply over the last 25 years. What's unique about this paper is that it's looking at exactly the opposite place. It's looking in the place where you wouldn't expect the dog to bark. These are Social Security benefits that are highly predictable and that are very certain, right? So you're getting a check next month. You probably can go and consult the calendar and say, okay, well, the next month I have 28 days, and the month after that I have 35 days until my next check. So this is extremely easy to forecast when this next check is coming with certainty. It's among a population, at least part of this population is elderly, and another part is disability, but this is a group that generally has a relatively low poverty rate overall. So we would think that among sort of the retired group of people who have relatively low poverty, who may have other resources in the form of other pensions or other savings, they should be able to plan around this very predictable event successfully. Whether it's 28 days or 35 days just simply should not matter. And what the authors show in some really convincing evidence, and I've just added one of the pictures from the paper at the bottom here, is they show rising overdrafts over the course of the month among these recipients, and it's higher in the months where it's 35 days between checks. And so even among this population, where you just simply wouldn't expect to find this type of excess sensitivity to the timing of paycheck receipt, the authors are still finding it, and they're finding it very clearly, and it's reflected in a range of different financial hardships that the authors measure in terms of overdrafts, in terms of bounced checks, and some other measures. And so what this paper is really suggesting is that these short-term budget constraints are highly binding. And this has been shown in a range of other studies as well. So it's not just among this group of folks where it's this predictable, but also around the timing of paychecks, where your hours may vary, and so there may be more variability paycheck to paycheck. It's been shown that there's a strong monthly cycle in expenditure on food among food stamp recipients. And so this paper is showing, using these two really neat new data sets, that the timing of Social Security checks matters for a range of financial outcomes. And I think the highlight here is this really clean identification, that there's no difference in the baseline characteristics of the people who receive their check on the second Wednesday versus the third Wednesday versus the fourth Wednesday, but we see these important differences in their financial outcomes ex post. So the key findings here are first that the 5-week month matters, so whether it's 28 days versus 35 days matters, and the other is that there's this mismatch between the timing of bills and the timing of benefits. So the people who receive their benefit on the fourth Wednesday of the month appear to do the best in terms of avoiding these negative financial outcomes. And the authors speculate, and I agree with them, that the reason is likely because the expenditures are more closely aligned with the timing of the benefit receipt. So there's fewer days in between where you have to think about budgeting, or fewer days in between where you experience some sort of household shock that would sort of lead you away from being able to make your predictable payments. And again, we're really in an extremely predictable setting. These are people who know they have a mortgage payment coming or a car payment coming, know they're receiving a benefit check in the coming month, and are still running into problems bouncing checks. So in terms of the project and thoughts and directions that the authors could push this a bit further, I wanted them to really highlight which subpopulations in their data are most affected by these constraints. So we know that the people who optionally choose to sign up for account aggregator websites like mint.com may be slightly unique. Our concern would be that those people are sort of differentially more likely to be disciplining themselves through these websites, right? I really need help with my financial planning, so I'm going to these websites, but we wouldn't think that would matter across Wednesdays, right? So we should think that the authors could still zoom in on the subpopulations where they may be most sensitive, and the group that seems obvious to start with is the group where the Social Security or disability benefits are the majority source of income in a given month. So this is going to be much more binding for that group. If you saw in the summary statistics, there are quite a few people who are generating other income inside the household. There's also a tension in the paper between the disability and the retirement groups and thinking about how they may be differentially sensitive to some of these things. So it'd be nice to try, even if there isn't a clear flag in their data for which is which, to try to separate those out. In terms of the subpopulations that I think would be interesting to study, there's a group here clearly whose spending is outstripping their income. So if you just look at the summary stats again, you see that the average expenditures in a given month are far above the average incomes, and maybe that's just a very skewed distribution, but I'd like to see the authors try to pin down some groups where that might be more balanced. And then finally, the results are a little bit less monotone than I would have expected. You would sort of expect that the day before you receive the check is always going to be the most difficult day for people, right? So that day before the check comes should be, far and away the day where I'm most likely to go and get a payday loan or bounce a check, and it doesn't seem like that's as consistent a story as I would have expected, so the authors could at the very least speculate on that path. In terms of policy, I think, again, this is really the right audience for this type of paper, and really thinking about why even what seem like small surprises, the difference between 28 days and 35 days on a Social Security check, be enough to steer households off course, right? So is this about income volatility? Is this about expense shocks? Is this about a failure to budget? But we should think hard about which of those dimensions is the real source of the problem here. We don't think for this group that it's income volatility, right? They're receiving the same size check each month. Then there's a question of what's the right policy response? Is it just as simple as making direct deposits weekly or daily, right? So spread the check out, across every single day of the month. That's not necessarily better, right? For some of the reasons that have come up earlier in thinking about behavioral biases and lack of financial planning, that receiving the lump sum may actually help some people budget, especially that fourth Wednesday group where there's just not a lot of time between when that check comes in and when they need to make their payments on the mortgage or the car. At the very least, this 5-week problem should be directly addressed through improved communication. I think making the benefit calendar more salient and seeing some experiments along these lines going forward would be a really useful next direction to say, how can we make it salient to people that they're going to need to stretch that check for 5 weeks in this coming month rather than 4. And then Jialan mentioned some of the other tools that we can think about, whether we just need to design the right app to better align income and expenditures going forward. But I think this is exactly the type of paper that really provokes a lot of interesting policy relevant questions, and hopefully the conversation can continue. Thanks very much.